Good evening, and welcome to this evening's webcast, Structural Frustrations, Challenges to Implementing Change. I'm John Hallway. I'm an Associate Dean at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and I'm the Executive Director at the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at Penn Law. It's an honor for me to have all of you joining us. It's an honor for me to be on this webinar with these great panelists. On behalf of my colleagues at Penn Law at the Toll Public Interest Center and Penn Law's Office of Inclusivity and Engagement, I want to introduce this webcast, which is the second in an ongoing series of conversations about racial justice and police reform, and part of a larger set of initiatives to support not just the Penn Law community, but our communities across the country in these challenging times. Penn Law has committed to support all communities in their anti-racism advocacy and to convene action-oriented conversations to advance the reimagining of a justice system that is truly just. We have much to learn and even more to do. In our last conversation, Beyond Reform, Re-envisioning the Role of Police, my colleague Dorothy Roberts led a conversation that illustrated the breadth of different meanings that people give to the term police reform. For some, that means modifying police approaches to use of force, to individuals with mental health or substance abuse problems, and other situations that police are confronted with daily. While for others, it means something more dramatic and substantive, such as decommissioning entire police departments and starting from scratch. We explored the frustration in our communities with the status quo. Whatever we do to improve social and racial justice in our communities, whether it's modifying today's police departments or building new structures that reimagine public safety and community engagement, we'll have to find ways to do it together. And that means understanding the structures that have prevented change in the past. Joining us today for this conversation are four individuals who have extensive experience in rolling up their sleeves and getting their hands dirty, trying to improve policing here in Philadelphia. And we're going to talk with them about the changes they'd like to make, but also the changes they tried to make and the realities of why those changes haven't been made and what it will take to make them. Joining us this evening are, in alphabetical order, Everett Gillison, the Penn Law Toll Public Interest Center practitioner in residence and a former deputy mayor for public safety and chief of staff of the city of Philadelphia. Angelica Hendricks, the policy analyst for the Police Advisory Commission for the city of Philadelphia. Charles Ramsey, a Penn Law Distinguished Policy Fellow and the former chief and commissioner of the Philadelphia Police Department. And Sozi Talante, a Penn Law lecturer and a former Philadelphia city solicitor. Before I turn it over to the panel, some quick administrative notes. We will have time at the end for audience questions. Audience members are encouraged to submit questions at any time during the webcast using the Q&A feature. You will not be able to see those questions when they're submitted, but we will be able to see them. It's unlikely, given the number of people that we have on the webcast, that we will be able to get to every question in the time we have. But we will do our best, and we will keep a log of those questions, and we'll provide some additional information on the website when we post the video. This website is being recorded, obviously then, and we will send out a subsequent communication when it gets posted online. So I'd like to ask all of the participants to unmute themselves and show their videos. And then let's go again in alphabetical order just for brief intros. And why don't each of you, please, let's get started by just naming a reform that you would like to see in place and what a barrier to the implementation of that is. And let's see where we go. To be egalitarian, let's go in alphabetical order. So Everett, that means you, then Angelica, Commissioner Ramsey, and Sozi. So Everett, take it away.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I appreciate the opportunity. I think the first one that I would try and do from the mayor's office point of view and the managing director's point of view would be to take a look at all of the proposed changes that we've tried to get from the charter to affect what policing is supposed to be, and once and for all put together a document and a structure that would allow us in the 21st century to police and also to have the citizens understand what they are asking us to do and have it reflected in the structure of the document that pulls us all together. I think that looking back over 30 years of suggested changes that have been made to the charter, especially around public safety, and I expanded not just policing, but public safety. The charter does have certain limitations on what it can do and how it can approach And I think it's about time for us to have that discussion and then move it going forward.
Thank you, Angelica.
Well, first, I want to start off by saying thanks, John, and thanks, Penn Law, for inviting me to have this important conversation. Again, my name is Angelica Hendricks. I'm a policy analyst for the Philadelphia Police Advisory Commission, which is the oversight agency for the Philadelphia Police Department. And in that role, I help offer recommendations to the Philadelphia Police Department to improve community police relations. And these recommendations are research-based, and the center of the research, most importantly, involves community engagement, reviewing Philadelphia Police Department policies, practices, and customs to ensure that policing is accountable and also equitable. And one reform that I would like to do is probably tackle what reform actually is. Reform can, if done incorrectly, can be more dangerous than having no reform at all. It could lead to communities believing that the problems have been solved. It could lead to a false sense of security, false sense of hope. It can also ensure that other social services that are impactful and helpful to the community are defunded because you're now giving those resources to these new policy endeavors. And it also can make sure or allow individuals or groups that are oppressing impoverished communities be more clever in how they are going to hide their oppression. So for reform, I think it's the first step is trying to make sure we actually define what the problem is. And the first step is making sure the community is involved in that. So what I would like to do is making sure that the community is always involved in every step of every policy proposal, because there are some proposals that do more harm to the community than good.
Thank you. Commissioner, you're up.
Okay, first of all, thank you, John and Penn Law, for inviting me to participate here tonight. To me, the biggest obstacle to reform in Philadelphia is the collective bargaining agreement. It makes it very difficult to hold officers accountable. I've had numerous instances where I took action against an individual only to have it overturned during arbitration. I think the union has gotten far too strong, too powerful, and controlled day-to-day management of the department to a large extent. Management rights have been eroded to a point where it makes it very, very difficult to run an organization like a police department. So unless that is changed and unless we make some changes there in the contract, I think it's going to be very difficult to really have true reform in Philadelphia Police Department.
Sozi?
Thank you, John, for having me. It's good to be back at Penn Law, I guess virtually. The commissioner stole my thunder because, at least certainly from a legal perspective, the greatest obstacle to reform is the arbitration process. And by that, I mean twofold, both the interest arbitration process. So most people think that the collective bargaining agreement is a result of the FOP and the city sitting down at the table, writing down the contract and agreeing to it. But in fact, it has to go through binding interest arbitration where there are 3 arbitrators and one's a neutral, and then there's one party arbitrator from each side. And that's a process that's very opaque. No one really knows what goes on there. And then at the end of that process, you spit out an award, which is embedded into the agreement. And then I would also tackle the grievance arbitration system. As the commissioner mentioned, I mean, what he said is the same thing you hear from Commissioner Johnson before him, Commissioner Ross after him. And in fact, Commissioner Outlaw is new, but she's already realizing some of the challenges with that. So I have some ideas about how to make those changes. Some of them are cosmetic, but a lot of them will involve some legislative changes, whether it comes to what you can appeal, how the arbitrators are selected, their qualifications, their ties to the community, and things of that nature. So, and I'll be able to spell that out as we go along. But we can think of the greatest reforms in the world, but I don't think that they can really change the culture if you have officers who are able to be reinstated despite the commissioner's strong feelings otherwise.
So we actually have a question already, Sozi, about Amending Act 111. So maybe you could for the audience, talk about what Act 111 is and what reforms to it might entail, and where does that, to Everett's point, is that a conversation about amending the city charter, or is that Harrisburg, or if we amend, where's the legislative body that has to enact those amendments?
Yeah, so Act 111, essentially, the police and fire cannot strike. So most other unions, if they don't like there's an impasse with the bargaining, they get to strike and be able to force they have leverage that way. Because our public safety officials, they can't strike, the legislature in 1968 passed Act 111. And so what Act 111 says, to the extent that the municipality, the local political subdivision, or the firefighters or the police cannot come to an agreement, we're gonna put in place this process, which is arbitration. And then at the end of that process, whatever the result is, you have to live with it, because there's really very limited appeal. And so in order to change the process, you need to have the legislature be able to amend it. And I think that there is a real possibility for reform now on the Republican and conservative side, because Act 111 applies to the entire state. There are cost issues. So Philadelphia, the arbitrator has to take into account the impact on our budget when deciding what award to give, in terms of benefits and salary. Because of PICA, there's another statute that's going to expire next year.
I was going to say that's going to expire next year. So watch out.
It's going to be big trouble. But the rest of the state, all the other local subdivisions, they don't have that. So they're actually, we talk about defunding and all that, but they're actually running up against real fiscal problems because the arbitrator issues an award and it has no relationship to the ability to get something passed. So there's a Republican House member called Russ Diamond who's proposed some legislative changes. Another on the other side, a Democrat, Representative Donna Bullock, she's actually proposed some changes, and we'll see what happens. And I can go through some of those changes. The problem is that the FOP, the statewide FOP, to Commissioner Ramsey's point, represents 40,000 officers across 1,100 police departments. So when you talk about might, that's real might. And so prior attempts to change Act 111, remember this is over 50 years old, has not gone anywhere, in part because of the concerns over that. And its relationship to the charter, Act 111, because of state law, it supersedes the charter. An example is residency. Our charter requires you to live in the city or move the city within 6 months of becoming an employee. The arbitrator in the past had said, no, we're going to award the FOP the ability to live outside the city. Of course, the city objected. We said, we have this charter. And then the arbitrator said, well, you're bargaining. That's you. You guys can change the charter. It has nothing to do with us. I can compel you. I can issue an award that overrides the charter because it's state law. Act 111 goes through state law. So that's been an issue. And it's something it will need to be amended before you have real substantial change.
One thing that I would ask, so just to point out though, Sosi, is, and to the commissioner, is the other piece that you have in Philadelphia that is pretty much unique to Philadelphia, is that you have both management unit and the line officers are all in the same union.
All in the same union, yeah.
So, Commissioner, I know that we had a lot of discussion about how to move that, and Sosi, I'm sure you may have had the same discussion. But Commissioner, how did that, didn't that really hamstring you, or didn't you feel that was a big problem? Because from everybody underneath the deputy commissioner, they're all in the same union. How does that affect, how does that frustrate change?
Yeah, I mean, well, the president of the FOP represents all of them. And so to me, it's a conflict when you've got a situation where a manager is taking disciplinary action against an individual, and but they're represented by the same union, and so it kind of goes back and forth, and it's really a joke. I don't have a problem with them being unionized, but they should at least be in a separate bargaining unit. And again, everyone from police officer through chief inspector, which is just 2 ranks below police commissioner, are covered by the union. In fact, until Mayor Nutter had the charter changed to increase the number of deputy commissioners, there were only 2 that were allowed in the department, just 2, which basically meant I had no ability to pick my senior command. So you're pretty much stuck with whatever it is you have. And we've got some people who are pretty high ranked that, quite frankly, don't have the leadership ability to hold that rank. But you've got them. They're civil service. There's nothing you can do about it, but try to put them someplace where they can do least amount of harm, quite frankly. So it's just not a good situation, and one that I've not encountered in the other departments I worked in, Chicago or Washington, D.C.
And to that point, Commissioner, I just, go ahead, Angelica.
Oh yeah, I was just going to respond to that. You know, arbitration is definitely a huge issue, but there's a lack of transparency even before we get to arbitration. So for access to the PBI hearings, you know, if there's a complaint and the complaint has been sustained and this officer is entitled to his due process, so he's going to have a hearing trial in front of 3 members, PPD. And right now there's a lack of access to that hearing, and it's supposed to be open to the public. And so how do we address that issue even before the officer files his grievance after the PBI hearing? And this is
PBI.
I'm sorry?
PBI.
Police Board of Inquiry.
Yes.
Acronym. We used to have it as a thing in the board. Say acronym free zone, people. Come on.
Yes. Police Board of Inquiry, where it's supposed to be open to the public, but where is that transparency now? Anyone can try to get into the room for the hearing, but currently it has 4 chairs, and there's usually the FOP rep who's there. And then you have your department advocate, the officer who's being accused of misconduct. So there's not adequate access to that hearing before arbitration even begins.
Yeah, and I was going to say that the issue with having the managers and supervisors, you know, you get from patrol to the chief inspector in the same union, is that, you know, the managers, because the FOP represents all of them, they pay, say, to discipline somebody, and if they're in the FOP and the FOP provides counsel to the person disciplined, it's the manager who actually pays for that. And then when you're also thinking about your proposal and bargaining, you know, you can't just keep it within the deputy commissioners. You got to use the, you know, folks who are lower rank. And obviously there's a conflict of interest there because, you know, they belong to the union that you're bargaining on the other side. So that's one of the reforms that, you know, I have on my list that really, Philadelphia is very, very rare in that instance. And I think New York has 5 different units, bargaining units within the department. So it's broken up.
One thing that I would mention, though, is that I know that what we tried to do during our administration was there are several case law issues, and Shelley Smith, city solicitor during our term, would sit down, and we had to give more, under the case law, we had to be able to push more authority down into the rank in order to justify if we were going to seek a clarification of union status. I mean, we did this as we were going through and trying to do reforms in public safety. We did it with the firefighters union because we wanted to make sure that the EMTs and the firefighters were in separate bargaining units, at least to be able to have that. That was something where we just agreed with the firefighters who wanted to be in separate units. We tried to use that as a reform matter to get them into separate so we could actually have different issues be bargained in a different way. Now, Local 22 and the firefighters still represented both, but they at least had to have separate interests going forward and to put forward and deal with things in a separate area. Those are things you have to be aware of, that, you know, a mayor's office or the managing director, that was a position I held in kind of both. I was able to kind of at least try to look out for these opportunities and move as quickly as you could once these opportunities came forward. But that's something to clarify that we would try to do. We did actually push, and the commissioner did push a lot more of the authority down to the captain level and even to the lieutenant level by going to the PD.
PSAs, police service areas.
Right, and that gave us the opportunity to set it up so that the next administration could come in and actually take and maybe actually ask for a role clarification, even under this, but that would be politically. And this is, again, the politics of all of this. You have to have and understand that a mayor has to deal with the politics and the political blowback that's going to be there, which is why the public has to be educated about these things as you go forward.
But I think Angelica raised a good issue too, because even with the Police Board of Inquiry, the transparency that needs to be there is not there in terms of allowing the public in, although I don't know if it would make much difference, to be honest with you, in terms of outcome, because what I have found is that depending on who the officer is on trial, again, when you pick the trial board, it's very difficult to find people that are just totally objective and going to rule based on the facts of the case. I mean, that's just reality. I would read some of their decisions and I would override. I mean, I had the ability to do that. And I can't tell you how many times I had to do that because what are these guys thinking? What did they read the file? And then you got the arbitration process. When you read the decision by these arbitrators, I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And that stuff should be out there for the public to see because some of this just makes absolutely no sense at all. And then when you finally do get an officer who does something really horrendous and people look and say, oh, he's got 18, 19, 20 prior complaints. Why is he still a police officer? Well, I've had people that I've had to fire more than once for different offenses, not the same offense. I fired them on one, they got back, came back, did something just as bad again. I fired him again. And one of them came close to coming back a third time, but we were able to prevent it.
And, for all of this, we can always move back to see where the problem is, because so now we can just move back to internal affairs. And so the internal affairs, they're looking to see if a complaint is going to be sustained or not from their investigation. And as a former public defender, preponderance of the evidence at the Criminal Justice Center in Philadelphia is different than preponderance of the evidence for internal affairs. And so that's another issue we have to address is what is preponderance of the evidence? Because if you look at some of these law enforcement agencies around the country, preponderance of the evidence to them is beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's unacceptable.
Well, I had the honor of co-chairing President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. And one of our recommendations was taking a look at these investigations and should they be done by an outside entity, whether that be a civilian board, which some departments do have that in place, Office of Professional Standards type of situation. You need an internal affairs to handle certain types of cases, perhaps, but the more serious ones, I really do think that having someone else take a look at it and would be very beneficial to everybody concerned. And so oversight is basically what I'm trying to get at. There needs to be strong oversight. And one of the things I found when I took over Philly PD, there was no training even given to internal affairs investigators. Right. When you get promoted to sergeant or lieutenant, you can't make the assumption that the person has an investigative background. They could have spent their entire career in patrol, or they've never had to do real investigations, just write preliminary reports, but not real investigations. And so they need to have the same kind of investigative training that a homicide detective would get. I mean, it's the who, what, when, where, why, and how of an investigation. And so you've got to give them the tools that they need and then carefully review these cases when they come up through command channel review, which is the process when a case is finished. It goes through a command channel of various ranks, lieutenant, captain, commander, all the way up the chain of command. And at every step along the way, they have to be very carefully reviewed and sent back if it's not done properly. So some of the cases we lost because of poor investigations early on. And we had to tighten that up because, when you really looked at that file, there were too many holes in it to really get a positive finding from an arbitrator. So some of it was the fault of the department as well.
Mm-hmm.
Angelica, to your earlier point about, the transparency of the PBI hearings, one of the things that was talked about in the last conversation that we had in this series was about the community's engagement in court watching, and the analogy that when communities participate in court watching, when we've got citizens in courtrooms watching bail hearings or misdemeanor hearings or whatever they might be, that's actually a form of the community saying, we don't think that this institution is really serving us properly, and we're going to gather a record and we're going to make that claim more broadly. Is that sort of court watching, is that something that you think would be useful in these PBI hearings? Because it might give an outlet for a broader transparency of the sorts of cases that the commissioner finds outrageous. And he didn't give any specific examples, though I'm quite confident that they exist. Is court watching an analogy that might be useful to us here?
Definitely. And is there safety in numbers? If you have a complainant who is considering, should I go down to the headquarters of the Philadelphia Police Department by myself and complain that an officer violated my rights somehow, he was verbally abusive or did a service or maybe even physically abusive, knowing that there are going to be community members there doesn't just benefit the community, it benefits the complainant because they're going to feel protected. And currently now we've heard several reports over the news of how there's a lack of access to get into that building for those hearings. Not just for the complainant and their witnesses, but also for civilians as well who have no relation to the case.
So I guess here's a question, I guess, for the group, because I'm much less informed than the four of you in how the city actually works. But it seems like a lot of the focus here is on arbitration decisions, whether that's the arbitrators who are looking at the collective bargaining agreement or the arbitrators who are reviewing grievances. And so I guess one of my questions is, are those arbitrators chosen by the same process? Are they the same people? And is there a way to change the arbitration process or the arbiters such that we have more just decision making? I mean, is the problem arbiter selection?
Sozi, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can jump at that. I think that's part of the problem. Both for the interest arbitration and for the grievance arbitration, the arbitrators come from the AAA. And anyone who's dealt with the AAA in any context knows that they have a diversity problem. And we say diversity, sometimes people think that that's just to make people feel better, but it actually really matters in this context because and I'll take grievance arbitration. If you've never been to a grievance arbitration, like a lot of the police officers testifying are very effective. They're very charming, and then so you'd see in the opinions, they would say, I agree with the facts that were found, but I've looked at this young man and, he's accused of consorting with prostitutes or something bad, but it's the first time it's sustained, so I'm gonna let it go, right? So I think having somebody who has a little bit of common sense and understand some of the dynamics would be helpful. And so an issue came up, and this is not just in the police context, this is also, they're not attorneys. And you saw with Jay-Z had an issue where he raised the fact that there was a lack of diversity with respect to the arbitrators on AAA that really kind of impacts how the arbitrators approach these decisions. So I think that's something that, and you talked about standards, Angelica, like they don't apply the law. You don't know if it's preponderance, clear and convincing. Some of them think is reasonable doubt. An example is if there's a police officer who goes to trial in a criminal case and they're acquitted, and any lawyer will tell you, acquittal just means like it wasn't beyond a reasonable doubt, but it could have been well beyond preponderance and certainly, and beyond clear and convincing. They automatically assume that if they're acquitted, that means, the charges have to be, at least in the employment case, have to be dismissed and they get their jobs back. So I think that's a real problem. And one thing in the city we're thinking about is how do we create a pipeline to get more attorneys involved to do some training so that we improve our pool of arbitrators, because as bad as some of them are, there's some people on the list that you just can't you just can't have arbitrating in any way. So that's a fundamental issue, and I don't know how this is like going in deep within the sort of the mechanics of it, but it really matters. And I would say for the interest arbitration, a neutral arbitrator, in my opinion, is one of the most powerful people in the city that nobody knows who he is, because he gets to decide wages, benefits. Our last contract in August 2017 is $245 million contract if you add all the increases and so forth. And the police budget, for the most part, I think it's Commissioner 96, 97% wages and benefits. So
Nice. Yeah, a little over 96.
that's the contract, right? And so nobody knows who this person is, and I don't read the contract, don't know his background. You Google him, he's an average dude just sitting around, and he gets to decide this really massive thing every 4 years. So I got a lot to say about it. That's my preliminary spiel.
Well, feel free to continue, right? I mean, so is the contract up for renewal, and is, in the order of things, do we need to be thinking about modifications to Act 111 in Harrisburg prior to the renegotiation of what's called a collective bargaining agreement, even though what it appears to be is submission of briefs to an arbitrator?
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
Go ahead. Go ahead. No.
You're a commissioner. I'm the attorney. So
I'm retired too. So my, I'm not really up to speed on this, but they did extend the contract for 1 year recently. This was just before the bottom fell out of everything because of COVID. So the president of the FOP, who is a sharp guy, I mean, he's a tough union boss, but you got to give him his propers. I mean, he knows his stuff. He anticipated what was going on. And he got in the mayor's ear, and he got a year-long extension with a raise. So yeah, it's going to be up. The question is, will the city actually, be able to put together something that an arbitrator would agree with in a new contract? Because it'll be a heavy lift. It'll be tough.
And to that point, that's where when you have people, you have the mayor's office and the managing director comes in, and we're looking at the financial, the first person that you meet when they give you this particular job, or when you're appointed to this job, is welcome to the finance director, welcome to the labor arbitrator, and welcome to the previous contract. And you have the city solicitor, the treasurer, and usually chief of staff, public safety, or the chief of staff, who is me. So I'm sitting in this seat, and then you have the commissioner. The commissioner can say, hey, these are the things that I need. Because if I get this is what I can do to help make everything better. And we want it to be better. And then the treasurer says to you, not the treasurer, the finance director says, yeah, that would be nice. But if you go in and you say that's what you want, it's going to cost you X number of dollars. And it's going to, because everything is you try to say, how are we writing our brief? What can we afford? And then you have this thing called PICA that says, well, the city only has so many dollars to give away. So what has happened? And over the years, what has happened is the city has given away certain management rights in exchange, because they couldn't afford to give the kind of dollar advances. And so this was submitted to arbitrators as a way of trying to make sure that you just don't give away too much. And that was a kind of a mindset. And ultimately what that did is that just hamstrings the ability of management to really advance what I call the culture change, which is really needed in the department. And it's the hardest thing to change. You can have all the policy, great idea policy stuff in the world, but unless you grab the heart, unless you grab and get good, strong leadership that's going to get the troops to actually, do the things we are asking you to do. The hardest thing that I knew that I had to have difficult discussions with the commissioner was that he would call me up and say, well, I'm sending over some things for you to review. And the worst thing that you have is police officers speaking out against people out of their mind, out of their names and whatever. And it's just that kind of stuff that came from the heart that ultimately, after a while, you just have to say you have to try to give up on this guy because we can't retrain him. But we can't also just keep putting them in places, neighborhood services, you keep trying to put people in, or pretty soon you got more people that are off to the side not working than you have people out on the street working. And as a mayor, and from a mayor's office point of view, you're not getting what you really need to sustain change going forward for the public to get buy-in to help support this dynamic that we call the city. So all of this is coming at you, and you're sitting there trying to say, no money, trying to get things done, trying to move the department forward, and you're trying to figure out what are you going to do in that moment? What are you submitting in that brief that will move that arbitrator to make a decision that'll give you a little bit more leeway in order to get the troops to go in the direction where you needed to go. And that's just you talk about frustration. That's a frustrating moment when you realize that's what you're called upon to do. And you're doing that over and over and over again.
John,
The
if I can
most
just say one last
frustrating
thing.
part.
Go ahead, Angelica.
The most frustrating part is having that frustration and then not talking to the community about it. So the community doesn't know anything that's happening. They don't know why is it that this officer who has violated someone's rights or physically abused someone is still with the force. They don't know that this person has been rehired or dumped at Divic or neighborhood services or some other entity within the Philadelphia Police Department. And that lack of transparency is what's going to impact police legitimacy. And it's also going to impact procedural justice, because people are going to feel as if they are treated unfairly. They're going to feel as if, you know, the city doesn't care about them. They don't care about their harm. And so even though we are all discussing what this frustration is, it's also important to include the community in that, to inform them, hey, these are your tax dollars as paying for this Philadelphia Police Department. This is what's happening with them.
Well, I know I was pretty vocal about my thoughts about the arbitration process and some of these individuals coming back, to the extent that I actually got sued a couple times, which fortunately those suits were thrown out because I was saying that I, had defamed them and all that kind of stuff. But, if I can just make one last point, John, before we move on to a different topic here. We were talking about accountability and, getting rid of bad officers and so forth. But that contract actually impacts your ability to be effective in dealing with crime issues as well, because it's very restrictive in a lot of ways in terms of being able to move personnel as you see fit. You wind up overstaffing certain units because you've got people there who aren't performing at an acceptable, they're at just enough of a level that they can't be really rated unsatisfactory, but they certainly aren't adding anything to the value of the operation. And so you wind up putting more detectives in homicide, or put more people here and more people there that you need, simply because, you've got some people that are weak, and it's very difficult to transfer them out of these units, or be flexible in terms of the hours, where if you see emerging trends and patterns, you have the ability to move, but you're limited to, I think it's like six times a year for 4 hours, a 4-hour shift. You can move an individual. Well, those 6 days get eaten up by the 4th of July, Christmas, New Year's. I mean, all your holidays, when you know you're going to need that extra resource. What happens when you get that sudden crime surge in the summer, and you need to make some moves in terms of flexibility without having to pay someone double time for having done that, So it impacts more than just holding officers accountable. It also impacts our ability to deal with crime issues.
Well, so it feels like all of this is actually very kind of intricate and interconnected in the different areas that we're talking about. And I wonder, perhaps this is why we have, so much outcry for structural reform, right? Because it feels like we're kind of trying to unspool this knotted ball that is really difficult to do. I wonder if what you all think about the example of Camden in 2013. And if we fast forward to 2020, I'm not saying that every problem in Camden has been solved by any means. But what Camden did in 2013, as I understand it, was they had an opportunity to change a little bit of the jurisdiction of the force from the city of Camden to Camden County. And in doing so, it gave them an opportunity to essentially hit Control-Alt-Delete and just sort of reboot their police force. The existing union was eliminated. A new hiring agreement was created. That new hiring agreement, as I understand it, was much more detailed, psychological profiling, things like that, to ensure a better quality of officer. All the old officers were allowed to reapply for their jobs, but not guaranteed a position. And then a new union contract was created that there was more control over with that new police force. Is that a model for us to be considering?
I don't know if that would work everywhere. Camden was kind of unique. I think it was the governor that actually put that in motion originally to Camden had so many different issues and financial troubles and the like. During that period of time, Scott Thompson, who was the chief at the time, he and I had a lot of conversations about that. But I think what a lot of people believe, which isn't true, is that they somehow got rid of that department and created this whole new one, which is true in a sense. It is a new department, but it was in place before they got rid of the old one. And so you didn't have any gap in public safety at all. I mean, it literally at midnight, you know, rather than the city respond to the call, it'll be the Camden County Police that'll be responding. But he was able to bring in new people. He was able to get a new contract in place. He was able to do a lot of things. I think it can work in some places. It may not necessarily be a one size fits all, where just every jurisdiction can do it. I think you can have some reforms without going to those drastic measures, but there are some instances where maybe that is something that could at least be looked at.
Yeah, and one of the things that I would point out, though, is that, again, if you want to just, since we are talking about frustrations, this is almost like my, I guess, I forget what it was in Seinfeld. Every December, there was an opportunity to put all the grievances on the poll.
Festivus.
Yes.
Festivus.
So this is our Festivus moment. But you sit back and you say, hey, look, we knew that we wanted to, after you do a data search, we ended up finding out that a lot of the problems that we were having could be traced to immaturity and a lack of experience. And so then you ask for a little bit more of an experience and you try to increase the rate of who's going to be a police officer. Is it just going to be someone with a high school diploma coming right out of high school and we give them a gun, go through training, give them a gun, give them a car, and off you go? And when we started to try to raise the standards of who was going to be a police officer, you got blowback, even though we explained it to the community, trying to figure out what we were doing. There was innate fear that you're going to end up having a different kind of representation in the department. And the commissioner would go around. We started sending people all over the country, trying to get people to come to the city of Philadelphia, not only just working inside the city, but also working outside the city to get people to raise the level. And I think we got up to associate's degree plus
2 years of college, yeah.
2 years of college, yeah, in order to make sure. But that was then reversed because they said it was impacting on recruitment, that they did not, or somebody felt that it didn't. So there's a lot of change that usually starts in one administration that usually stops in the next. And that lack of continuity, that lack of vision that is actually brought on to by the community, because I keep thinking that this has to come out of the community of what they want and see in their officers and what they see in their public safety. That has to be what drives it, so that one mayor and another mayor doesn't get to stop and start what is going on, and it becomes legitimacy throughout because the community demands it. Those are kinds of things and kinds of questions I think that we have to have an honest discussion of, because one administration feels one way, another administration feels another, and all you're getting is these halting changes along the line of what's called supposedly a public safety vision for the city of Philadelphia.
If I could just add on to that, Everett, the change that happened in Camden, it doesn't necessarily mean it was a reform. So there's a difference between a change and a reform. And from a lot of the articles that I read, if you talk to people of color there, in particular Black people, there is no reform. There is a change. The officers may look different, they're dressed differently. They're discussing now having a union, but a lot of people, the communities that are disproportionately impacted by policing, they say that there has been no reform.
Well, to that point, one of the questions that we always tried to do, because when the mayor came in that I served under and Chuck served under, we were worried about our overriding interests came out of shootings, following shootings and trying to figure out what was going on with shootings, following homicides, even though both the commissioner and I agreed, coming at it from two different perspectives, but we both agreed homicide is just a function of good hospitals. Shootings are really what you have to follow as an indicator. And so we tried to find ways and means. Commissioner came from a community policing background. I came out of a community focus trying to figure out, which is why we did Philly Rising in the trying to do community rebuilding to help deal with the issues that were coming out of those specific communities and have those specific communities define for themselves what public safety would look like in Hartranft, in Sharswood, in Swamp Poodle, where we were having the biggest problems, but trying to get the community to define for itself and work with a new community policing effort to see if we could build that trust back as we were going forward. That model actually began to show promise because we ended up seeing that the shootings were going down because we were actually getting the legitimacy was coming back and the trust was going up. And where we found trust going up and that we saw the numbers speak for themselves, the shootings were going down, the homicides then were going down, and we actually ended up with a pretty good opportunity to expand. And we kind of left that as a means to help have people go forward and got frustrated because in some communities, they define things in a different way and we had to figure out how to do that. But listening to communities was the hardest and longest period because we had to get them involved with the process. And you have to invest in that and that costs money. And I know the first thing that happens when administrations change is that the money dries up. So, well,
they also abandoned many of the things that we were doing as well. So,
yeah.
I mean, in all honesty. And I mean, Philly is pushing 400 this year. I mean, it's really a shame. And I believe you can have a bigger impact than that. But that's just me.
Everett, the research just shows that when you're talking about urban violence, city violence, what is most correlated with that is not unemployment, it's not education, is not even poverty. It is police legitimacy. So people do not trust the police. And so the program that you're talking about, there have been several evaluations of it that actually show that measure was not impactful for the individuals who were targeted within that structure. Maybe because there was no procedural justice. There wasn't an explanation to these individuals as to why the city believes that they are the reasons violence has been increasing. And
I just think you're talking about focused deterrence. I wasn't talking about focused deterrence. Okay. I was talking about Rising, which was a community building program that we had that went along with a lot of other issues, but it was at the base of it, trying to go to the very communities, having community meetings, working through and redoing a lot of the trust issues. That's where I met Captain Cram for the first time in Hartranft at the time when he was with the 25th. Because we were having such problems. And the only way I felt that we needed to redo things is to work from the community base up. And that was the emphasis and retraining officers who were going to have to walk a beat instead of being in their cars all the time. Focused deterrence, I can talk about that kind of, those programs, the JET program, focused deterrence, the community interrupters, John Rich's program at Drexel, those were layered on top of what we called a community building model from the beginning, from the bottom up, that then allowed us to have different ways of figuring out how to take it to the next level. But we started with 6 units around the city and built a community outreach and tried to knit the police officers with the community and ask them, you define what safety means for you here. We're listening. And that's what we did. We started that in 2010. At the height of the recession, we started that.
But I just want to get one point of clarity though from Angelica. Did you say that lack of police legitimacy was the driver behind violence?
No. So not the lack of, it's the association. What is associated with it in the community? And so there was a survey done about maybe 8-10 years ago where individuals were surveyed to see, what do they believe is the cause of violence? And Also, Andrew Papachristos in Chicago did a study. He's a professor at Northwestern, did a study on violence and what can we address to try to narrow violence, limit it. And one of the biggest issue was police legitimacy.
So police legitimacy is behind one guy in a community shooting another guy in a community? Because I don't get it. I understand police legitimacy is important, don't get me wrong. But a lot of the nonsense we have out there on the street, I do not believe has anything to do with that at all. And
well,
so
it's the community believing that nothing will happen to those individuals. Like they don't trust the police department to actually solve the crime. They don't trust the police department to listen to, you know, their viewpoint on what they saw, what they heard. And so there are a lot of studies that show that police legitimacy is tied to that.
well, when you get crickets, when you go out and start canvassing an area and you try to get people to come forward and no one says anything, and then later say, well, you know, police aren't going to solve the crime. You can't solve the crime if you don't have witnesses, if you don't have evidence, if you don't have the things you need to be able to put a case together. And very rarely is there a case, a shooting or a homicide, where nobody knows who did it at all. I mean, you know, somebody knows. And these guys
what's happening now?
Over and over and over again, and it's not going to stop. So I'm not saying that police we don't have a ways to go, and there's not a need for reform and all that stuff. But I also think community violence and communities have to start taking some responsibility for some of this stuff that's going on out there. And I don't hear that. I don't see the outrage when we have a weekend like we just had, or Chicago, 87 people shot, 17 murdered just over the 4th of July holiday. I mean, where's the outrage on that? And I just don't see it. And I, you know, 47 years of going to crime scenes, hundreds if not thousands of them. I mean, you know, police got their own burdens to bear, but communities got to step up. And
Well,
right now, I don't see it.
Just a couple of months ago, Council Member Kenyana Johnson held a hearing on the victims of violence and also co-victims of violence. And there were several individuals there who testified that they were a witness to a shooting, witness to a homicide, and they felt as if the Philadelphia Police Department did not do what they wanted to happen as far as protecting them. One woman in particular talked about how her daughter was a witness and she asked repeatedly for protection. They weren't moved. She felt scared to bring her daughter to court. They weren't relocated. And then a couple of days beforehand, you know, police barged into her house with neighbors watching, dragging her out of the house to go to court. And so when you have testimonies like this is coming from the people. It's belief that they will not be protected.
We have been to enough hearings to know, you know, I mean, you're always going to get people come with extreme cases and so forth. And I'm sorry that happened. But call Kenyatta Johnson then, if you don't want to call 911. Call somebody. But this stuff about blaming somebody else for everything that's wrong in the community, I'm sorry. I stopped buying that a long time ago. I've just seen too much. I've heard too much. And the bottom line is this nonsense needs to stop. We got a one-year-old baby shot and killed, 8-year-old girl shot in the chest and died. I mean, you know, come on. Where are we going with that? And the only people that are going to save community are people in the community. Nobody's going to come, Calvary's not going to come charging over the hill to save any of these, in any community. We can be there to help and do the best we can, but community is the only ones that can really, truly achieve the kind of safety we're talking about and we'd all like to see.
Well, the studies weren't saying that the other factors were not, you know, impacted for violence. It was just saying that the factor that.
I think she froze up on me, but listen, I appreciate studies and I realize everybody is very well educated. I just got too much street in me, I guess.
Well,
because studies.
Well, I mean, Commissioner Evans, you're talking about Chicago, but Philly,
Philly, we're pushing 400.
Yeah,
huh?
I mean, I think 210, a little bit north of 210. That same weekend, we had 35 shots.
But my point, I was trying to point to an extreme there. You know, I'm from Chicago, so obviously I can still look at that. But Philly's no different. It's just a smaller city. But there's no way Philly's going to come in under 400 this year, and that's a doggone shame.
Angelica, I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back.
You said nice things about you.
It's not clear to me. Let me just hang on for a second. It's not clear to me that the protests that we've been seeing in Philadelphia and other cities aren't in part these cities and these communities wanting to take some of that responsibility, Commissioner, wanting to take some responsibility for the things that are going on in their communities. And so I guess one of the questions, and this has come in a couple of times in the Q&A thing, so I'd like to elevate it to this conversation, is other than protesting, what should the citizens of our communities be doing to regain that power to define what policing is, right? I mean, I know that one of the conversations we had when we were preparing for this was that we think police are doing too many things, that there's a grab bag of things that police are asked to do that goes beyond the purview of things that we're able to train them for. And I think there's a lot to unpack there, but other than protesting, what should our communities be doing to take that kind of responsibility that you're describing, and to sort of take that ownership back of defining what policing ought to be in their communities?
What policing ought to be, or how to stop the violence?
Well, hopefully,
because I mean, it's
the one would lead to the other, and I'm not singling you out, Commissioner. I mean, I'm asking this to all four of you. So let me be clear about that.
I was just waiting. I was waiting to see what the commissioners say.
Oh, listen, I've been talking a lot here, kind of going off a little bit. So you guys go ahead. I'll throw in something here, and
Community building is what has to really happen. I mean, the first thing that really has to come out is just to be able to have people not shut their doors and just say they're worried about themselves. They have to. I mean, I know it's an old-fashioned belief. But I am a creature of the city that I grew up in. Philly has always been a city of neighborhoods. There used to be pride in the neighborhood. There used to be pride in the places that you ended up dealing with. And the economics or the poverty was shared by everybody, because we all looked at each other and said, we all in the same boat. We all got to be in the same area. And we all tried to work together as best we could. And when we were having the growth of violence, when I was coming up, the community did actually get together and put together an idea. I mean, this whole idea of community interrupters, I laughed when I was in the administration, because, I came up with Herman Rice and the Great Society and Benny Swann's out of the 60s and the 70s, talking about the community get together, work with the police, and the police were a lot different than they are then than they are now. But the bottom line is that there were people in the community that you actually knew, that you respected, and they would actually mitigate a lot of the turf wars that were going on, even back then in the 60s and the early 70s. And we are talking about rates of crime, when you look back then, that if we had that today, we would actually laugh and say, oh my God, we're in a different part of Nirvana. 37 people would be killed in a year, not 37 people killed in a weekend or over a 2-weekend period. So there is a history in Philadelphia for people taking care of and being responsible in their neighborhoods, and then working with the institutions to come together and define what safety looks like. That's what we were trying to rekindle, because that, when it really is done well, it works. It does work, and legitimacy, that whole piece, will come out of, but the effort has to be on the repairers of the breach. Somebody's got to stand in that area and to be able to pull people on. The issue that we found is that there's a lot of people who say they will be able to talk for the community and who will want to get paid for getting for contracts that they would want to get with the city to be in this space. But the data doesn't really show that they really are providing anything except jobs for a couple of people. It's having that kind of honest conversation that we were advancing and trying to advance, to say, let's really start looking at the programs, which is why my point was, there are programs that the city of Philadelphia has always been an innovation hub. And, you talk with the John Riches, you talk with the folks that are all over that have an idea, and we try to use that and say, if it works here, can it work elsewhere? But always remember, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all for Philly. We are different in our different neighborhoods. You have different attitudes that you got to be aware of, and you got history that you have to deal with. And understanding that is integral to actually having legitimacy in the city. And when that's taken away, then you end up having all of this stuff fall apart. So I hear what the commissioner is talking about, but I think that what we really need to get back to is listening to and trying to build on the efforts that were made to try to get the communities to rebuild. Poverty, economics, jobs. As the commissioner knows, he used to call me and he said, Everett, you're still a tree hugger because you still believe. And I said, yeah, we get the guys who are in jail, get them to come out and stop doing. You don't have to worry about chasing them. And if I can get them a job, guess what? We were able to do that and actually get that workforce, and they became pretty good. And then they were legitimized back in the neighborhood, and they would say, hey, look, I've already been up state. I'm already back. I ain't going back up there. I'm not doing this nonsense, and you shouldn't either, young boy. And this is how we have to have those kind of real discussions. But investing in community building, there's already millions of dollars that come both from the feds and the city. We spend an awful lot of DHS money talking about anti-violence stuff, but the majority of that, as I found out, was not being spent well. And then when you start to take money from one side and take it away from some, sacred cows and put it someplace else, oh my God, city council just keeps me on my phone every day. So those are the kinds of frustrations you're gonna have, but that's where it really needs to start. But you also have to have the police alongside of you, because if you don't have that, at the end of the day, when the window breaks, they still call in 911, and somebody's going to expect that a police officer, unfortunately, that's all we have paid to come back and to answer. If we can develop others, that's fine. But right now, that's where it is.
So let's talk about that for a minute. Let's talk about, the word defunding is being thrown around a lot, and lots of people have different things in their mind when they hear the word defunding. But to the point of, us asking police to do things that police aren't particularly well suited for, should we be reallocating either individuals in the police or roles that the police have? And how do you do that in a context where you've got 37 people being shot over a weekend in ways that don't ignore that reality either? I mean, I haven't heard anybody say, I don't think that defunding means ignore safety of the communities. And so how do those two things juxtapose, in your minds?
Well, I think it just depends on what you mean by defunding. I've been frustrated with it because, I hear defunding means take away all the money or something like that. And the issue we have, and that's why I had the commissioner confirm the amount of the police budget that's wages and benefits, is because, we agreed to that, right? We negotiated that. And so what ends up happening is that a lot of times when people want money, they put in the police budget, because they know nobody will fight the police in terms of the budget increase. Like the example is John McNesby got an increase, a year contract increase. Police got 2.5% salary increase. Everybody else got 2%, during the pandemic. So I think the issue we always had, Commissioner Ross said this, I'm sure Commissioner Ramsey, the police are asked to deal with homelessness, opioid, and mental health stuff. And when they complain, people say, well, that's what we're tasking you to do. It takes real difficulty to step back and reimagine sort of what we actually want to be able to do in those services. And my concern now is that you're just going to have these cuts that aren't really tied to the priorities, that aren't really tied to, where you need services. So I think it's an ongoing discussion. I have no problem with taking school guards, crossing guards out of the police budget and putting them in the managing director's budget, but I don't think that's what we're talking about. I never understood that anyway. So
yeah, this whole, I don't think you'd find a police chief that would argue that if you want to take away, certain, responsibilities, responding to, substance abuse calls or homelessness or dealing with people in a mental health crisis. If social services will do a better job, fine. That's not a problem. But here's what I believe is going to happen. I believe that the money will be taken out of budgets for a couple of reasons. Number one, cities are broke because of the COVID crisis, so they're looking for money anyway. But I don't think it's going to go to those social services that are going to be the ones that can pick up the slack and be able to respond to those situations at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning. And so, defunding, taking money, that's fine. But I would strongly suggest that people follow the money, because I guarantee you it's not going to go in a place where they're going to be able to staff social services to a point where they're going to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to respond to these various calls. And many of the calls are dangerous, which is going to still require some police response. We don't have to be the primary responder, it could be backup, which is fine. But I believe that in many situations, the money's going to be taken, but the responsibility will not go with it. And that's my fear, is that because you're going to wind up losing personnel, because if 97% of your budget is personnel costs and they take $19 million or $20 million out of your budget, it's going to impact personnel. There's no question about it. You're going to have to either trim down like we did during the recession, right? We didn't lay anybody off, but we didn't hire anybody either for about 2 years. And that has a direct impact. So I just think it needs to be carefully thought through. It's not an argument on whether the police are doing too much. The answer is yes, but it got to be that way because at 2 o'clock in the morning, who else is around? That's why it is. That's where it's at now.
And I think that during the discussion we had, we were talking about, you have the issue about the dogs that are out of control. So we ended up, and I'll take the hit. We ended up having to, during our administration, we were hemorrhaging money. We had $1 billion, 1 year, $1 billion shortfall we had to look for and to cut. I was transferring money as much as we could so that if public safety, again, public safety was my focus. If public safety didn't take a trip and get money out of public safety, there would have been no part of the city that was left, because we have to balance our budget. So I had to go to the commissioner. We had to sit down and figure out, how are we going to control overtime? How are we going to control this? What can we not respond to? What are some priorities that were not 1, 2s, and 3s, but maybe the priorities that were 6s, 7s, and 8s, just don't have it. I remember the whole argument we had about, well, we're not going to respond to auto accidents anymore, because for the most part, unless there's life and limb that needs to be dealt with, we have to deal with this. We actually put that fully before the public when we went to them and said, this is what we're doing in the budget, because we have to make choices. Budgets are about the choices that you make. And we tried to make sure the public was fully aware. And when we announced, all right, one of the things we're not responding to is automobile accidents, it took the culture a long time to figure out that after an automobile accident, they were calling 911, and 911 says, we're not, unless is anybody hurt? No? Okay, then you guys can figure that out. Take the pictures, deal with your auto, but we're not coming unless you're blocking the intersection, I think it was.
Right, car's not drivable. Right.
Car's not drivable. But other than that, we weren't coming. And that takes time for the public to understand, but that was a way for us to try to lessen the load, because we didn't have the number of officers that these decisions that were economic decisions were being placed on us when you're talking about crafting a budget in the mayor's office. So those are the kinds of ways you have to deal with, and the public has to understand. The other part of public safety was the dealing with the prisons. So it wasn't just, are the police locking people up? We started, I can't say that it was, but I worked with the district attorney at the time and kept saying to him, marijuana arrests, when I did the data analysis, marijuana arrests, we did 10,000 arrests a year because it's on the books. And we ended up saying, if we diverted all those arrests and not give people records that would keep them from getting hired in the future, if we can divert them, then at least diversion will lessen the amount. Well, diverting the 10,000, we ended up going in 1 year from 10,000 arrests down to 2,000 because nobody was getting court time. And then after then we showed that there was no real public safety hit for that. Then the whole idea, and I think Jim Kenney, then Councilman Kenney said, well, why don't we just go through the citation piece and only cite people civilly as opposed to that, which then caused another problem for the finance director and the administrative end, that, you know, the city solicitor's office and the treasurer's, the finance director's office had to deal with all the civil stuff that came as a result of that. But we had to think through what the economic impact and savings could be by not doing the arrest. But the other piece of that is quality of life, because now the public started complaining that you had more people lighting up everywhere. And they were really objecting to that as we were going through this culture shift. But it was as a direct result of trying to help save money and save police for what police really need to deal with, which for us was try to put as many people out to get these shootings down as much as possible. That was our overriding issue. And that's why we tried to do what we did. And, you know, there were ups and downs to that, but quite frankly, saving, you know, there were more people alive at the end of the year than there were in the heretofore, and you know, we take that as a collective win.
So Sozi, as the city solicitor, you're dealing with lawsuits against the police for various activities, and maybe you could talk a little bit about whether that is a form of community engagement that could bring about reform in ways that some of these other structures we've talked about haven't. I mean, are the financial incentives of responding to that a useful political tool? Are there practical terms that could be worked into settlements that are enforceable? Or, you know, is that something that gives us some traction somewhere?
No. You want me to explain? I can give you some backup.
No, just stop there. That's fine.
No, the reason I say no is because, you know, lawsuits aren't really an effective vehicle for change. I mean, they're great. They're for a couple of reasons. One, they take too long, right? In our mind, you get a lawyer, you go to court, you know, you get a judge, and you settle. You go to trial. That takes 2 weeks, but in reality, it takes years, right? And two, the lawsuits themselves may not reflect systemic issues. Right, it's hard unless it's a class action. It's hard to be able to tease out what the underlying issues are. I think and my concern sometimes is that, you know, instead of a lawsuit, sometimes they take the air out of the room. That, you know, instead of like going to court, some of those issues we better brought, you know, to political actors or to the PAC or you know, it doesn't have to be one or the other. But sometimes I think that's a more appropriate venue. But and we've had historically where lawsuits can spur reform. You had the, you know, NAACP lawsuit in the 80s and 90s. There was a task force that was put together after it to examine police conduct. But where I think we're the most effective, like sort of legal tool, courtroom related tool, is have the Department of Justice do a pattern and practice investigations. Those are the most powerful ways, where you have the Civil Rights Division of DOJ, and this is very effective under President Obama. You know, they did 25 of these investigations: Baltimore, Ferguson, Chicago. They do an investigation, they reach out to the city. There's a consent decree, and that's monitored. And, you know, under this administration, it's been used once, and we don't even know what the status of that case is. It's Springfield, Massachusetts. But I think that's a very, you know, very powerful way to really figure out where systemic issues are. And I think Commissioner Ramsey did something, you know, that was very powerful. It's not a lawsuit, but it's, let's say, collaborative reform, where you bring in DOJ and they work with you. They you know, they have, when you guys left, Commissioner Ross came in, we had the 91 recommendations, going through them, and the shootings went down. I mean, it was you know, it also involved shootings. So there are other tools there, and I just think that those are often overlooked, and maybe some of them, because of where the DOJ is right now, they're not available. But on the whole, there was an instance, a settlement where the plaintiff's attorney, it was the largest police shooting settlement we had, where they wanted a policy change, but it's policy we're doing anyway, to do training on plainclothes officers, because civilians see a plainclothes, they don't know that's an officer. They run, officer, you know, is involved in some activity. So that's something we're doing anyway. But I remember Commissioner Ross saying, you know, you don't want reform to come by lawsuit after lawsuit of lawsuit. You have to step back and look at the macro issues. And that's why I think collaborative reform and DOJ consent decrees are actually better tools, because they're more informed.
You know, just recently, the ACLU released their report on the consent decree for stop and frisk. for the
Bailey, yeah.
Bailey, right. And so in that report, they found from an audit that they did of stops that 40% of them relate to quality of life. And from, I believe from 2018 to present, they didn't find a significant change in the number of stops. And they also argued that the stops that have been conducted for unconstitutional reasons has actually increased. So when we look at lawsuits, we're thinking about, policy, what can change from this? And I wanted to look at who were the original plaintiffs in that case. So I actually just last night was like, well, how are these people impacted by this consent decree? And one of the named plaintiffs, since the consent decree started, had been stopped for traffic offenses over 10 times over the course of about 8 years. And none of those stops related to speeding. I believe 6 of them were for not carrying a license while driving, which doesn't explain the reason for the stop. 2 of them were for stop sign, and 1 for failure to have a proper admission sticker, which was found not guilty later on in traffic court. And so we have this consent decree that's been monitored by several different agencies, but even the named plaintiffs there are still being impacted.
So one of the questions that's come in on the chat is an interesting one that relates, I think, to the kind of concept of legitimacy and community policing and procedural justice, and the relationship between the officers and their communities. It says one of the frustrations that people in under-resourced communities experience is an inability of the police to discern victim from victimizer, right? Who is a victim and who is a victimizer? And the police, the perception that the police fear the people that they are supposed to be protecting. How do we figure out or change whether that perception is true, change that fact if the perception is true, or the frustration of the community if it's not?
Well, just recently, John, the PAC just sent Philadelphia Police Department a report on GVI, the upcoming group violence intervention. And in that report, we discuss the complex nature of victim and offender, how they all come from the same communities, go to the same grocery stores, attend the same schools. And so when you're engaged in investigation, policing, we're talking about the same community. So one thing that's important is procedural justice, because unfortunately the individuals who are going to be labeled a violent driver or potentially someone who may cause harm with gun violence may unfortunately be one day a victim to gun violence. And so we have to treat all of them, every single resident of Philadelphia, with respect, with courtesy. And, we have to increase procedural justice. And currently right now, the only avenue for the Philadelphia Police Department to remedy procedural injustice is internal affairs. And so some individuals, that's not enough. They ask for more, they deserve more. And so for the Police Advisory Commission, we have been asking for the Philadelphia Police Department to create more ways to explain what procedural justice is and offer it.
Well, first of all, I would agree with that assessment. The other thing, though, I just want to mention when you talk about police officers and being fearful or suspicious of individuals in some of our neighborhoods, I think some of it gets to the mental health of officers and how often they're exposed to traumatic incidents over and over and over again. And it's easy to become jaded if you're not careful. And so that's why I think, community policing, and at least my idea and how I've always believed in it, really getting to know the people in the neighborhood. I mean, really getting to know people in the neighborhood. We started something a few years ago. I heard recently it's stopped, but all recruits that graduated from the academy started on foot patrol in some of our most challenged neighborhoods, not to be enforcers, even though they did have an impact on some crime occurring in public space. But by walking in these neighborhoods, they learned very quickly there are more decent, law-abiding people living there than there are criminals. But if you're in that police car going from 911 call to 911 call, you start to get this perception that there's crime all around, that everybody's involved in crime and all this sort of stuff, which is absolutely not true. But it's easy to fall into that trap if you don't make an effort to get to know people, the young people in the neighborhood, know the difference between, you know, a basketball team standing on the corner waiting for the bus, as opposed to maybe gang members or drug dealers standing around on a corner somewhere, because you know people. And so, you know, I think the constant exposure to trauma over the years, and we don't do a very good job in policing and dealing with it, but there needs to be regular mental health checkups for cops. If it's every year, every other year, but you gotta have mental health checkups, because it's easy to become jaded. It's easy to kind of develop that fear, and we don't talk about it, but it's real, right? And that causes overreaction in certain given situations, right? You become hyper vigilant because you think everything around you is danger everywhere, right? And so it's because we don't really take care of our people from that standpoint. And I really do think that's a strong reason why we have some of the problems that we have.
Agreed.
Well, I think it bears notice that more police have died in the past several years on an annual basis for the past 3 or 4 years, at least, as how far back I've seen it. More police have died at their own hand than in the line.
Well, yeah, suicide, divorce, alcohol, substance abuse. I mean, the police are higher than the average in terms of numbers. And I think I said divorce. I mean, all those negative indicators, you know, police are right there. And a lot of it has to do with the job stress. You know, I'll be honest with you, when I made up my mind to retire when my last police officer, Robert Wilson, was murdered, and it was on video and I watched it. And I had 8 line of duty deaths in the 8 years I was there. And I couldn't bury another policeman. I've spent my whole adult 47 years dealing with homicide, rape, robbery, and I had enough. I couldn't do it anymore. And that's when I knew it was time for me to step down. And so, you know, it gets to you over a period of time. It just does. And I'm not the only one.
So we're 5 minutes left or so to talk, and maybe I'll lob out another question for any of your thoughts, and we can, you know, use it or go on to other things as useful. You know, and Angelica, I don't know if I'm putting you in a good spot or a bad spot here, but the mayor has announced a new police citizens committee that's going to have some new obligations in working with the city. And I guess my question for the group would be, and Angelica, if you can't answer this question being in the pack, let me know. And I really don't want to put you in a bad spot. But what powers should that committee have to be a useful force for change in the city? Are the powers that have been proposed for it clear and sufficient? Should there be other things? What would we want to make sure that this new organization can do to maybe be a force that the communities can use to be that more compelling, more coercive voice for change?
Well, the first thing is access to information. As we have seen from several oversight agencies, and oversight is public safety. It's also a part of the discussion. There have been many oversight agencies who complain that when they get a complaint, it's hard to investigate it. It is difficult to receive information from the Philadelphia Police Department. Just recently, there was an article in the Washington Post about CCRB, which is the community-led one in New York City, that said that for most of their complaints, they still have outstanding body-worn camera. And so that wouldn't be an issue if the agencies have direct access to the information. And so it's hard to oversee things when you have to ask the entity that you're overseeing for the information, because then it's like a heads up, hey, I'm going to be looking into this. Can you please give me this information? So direct access is important. And also just the power to influence change. And I was just thinking about this the other day, that with technology now, we've kind of gotten into a society where, unfortunately, change doesn't happen just by the pain of or harm of one person. It takes the suffering of hundreds, thousands, and all these statistics being thrown around before people are influenced to make changes. And so whatever oversight agency that's going to happen within Philadelphia, within the larger nation, needs to be able to impact change even by one mere complaint of misconduct.
I would agree with Angelica, and it has to have teeth. It has to have real teeth if it's going to be effective. They do need to have direct access to information. They shouldn't have to go through a department. They should have access to any of the databases that they need to have access to. Before I left, I remember, maybe a year ago, I actually put the head of the advisory commission on the force review board, on the shooting review board. Is that still the case? I don't know if they still got I got a lot of pushback on that.
Yes.
But I got a lot of pushback on that, but I gave them a position on there. They should be able to sit when we're reviewing. This is when you have officer involved shootings and it's presented, here are the facts, here's what happened, here's the video, all that sort of thing. Gave them a seat on the board. I mean, they need to be able to see what's going on firsthand, not hear it, second or third hand. They need to be able to see it. But it was pushback on that one, believe me. I'm glad to see that that's still the case. Mm-hmm. We put it in a directive to kind of codify it a little bit there, but it's got to have teeth. It's got to have teeth, otherwise it'll be useless.
And I think they're going to need funding because unfortunately, sometimes with the review boards, you have a big mission, but if you don't have the funding to support it, then you lose credibility with the public because
right.
They go to you with complaints and expect investigations. Nothing happens. It takes a while. So the funding has to match the ambition. And that's where the rubber meets the road, in terms of if we wanted to investigate, you got to get professional investigators. You want the policy stuff, you see how good Angelica is. You got to get like 4 or 5 of her to do the studies so that they have the support. And one thing I had in the law department is like, I would deal with the Police Advisory Commission and they didn't have access or they really weren't part of the structure, so to speak. They were sort of external. They would come in and follow on the police department, but not having their own sort of substantial budget and standing was a problem. So that's what I'm looking for in terms of not just the subpoena powers and all that, but also see like what's the staff going to look like. Are you guys in a little corner? You're in a conference room, like 3 tables, or are you in a wing of MSB or One Parkway? So there
are a lot of oversight agencies where their budget is tied in directly to the budget of the police department that they're overseeing. It could be 1% of their budget, 1.5, 2. But yeah, the budget is definitely important because internal affairs, I believe when I checked the budget for internal affairs for that unit is about 22 million.
Yeah,
that's pretty much all salaries too. So.
Yeah.
And what I would just suggest that it is always a function of systemic change when you're going to end up to be part of the system. And what I fear more than anything else is that the public very quickly loses its focus when you become part of the system, because then you get co-opted. So there's this tension that you have to be aware of, that the public will say, yeah, we want a independent board, but then you very quickly, as the commissioner has said, you need to really be part of what's going on in order to get the full flavor of what's happening. And I just think that there's not enough time or effort spent explaining every year what you do, how you do it, the outreach to the public, the education to the public. All of that has to be part and parcel of any systemic change for it to really last. Because the biggest frustration that you can see from one administration to the next is that everybody wants to have their own independent stamp on it. And if it's not made part and parcel of the of what's going on, it just kind of goes away. And we already have seen an issue that the public's attention span is not that dramatic. I've been heartened by the fact that we've been now in this particular moment for a lot longer, and it seems that we are getting concrete examples of change, systemic change in the system. I just want to make sure people continue not only the pressure, but actually keeping ahead of that systemic change to make parts, and don't just say, well, now that they're part of the system, we really can't deal with it.
John, I know you were asking questions, but if you don't mind, I have a question for you. We're talking about the FOP. Do you know the Vice President of the United States is in Philadelphia, probably as we speak or earlier today? Do you know where he went? He didn't go to City Hall. He didn't come to Penn Law. Where was he?
FOP.
I'm going to guess he was at the
FOP
FOP.
Lodge. And I think
FOP
that's why
headquarters.
we'll never have a Camden. We're in a totally different scale of, the sort of power. And John McNasby has been very effective, very effective.
Well, I think one of the, we've covered a tremendous amount of ground. We are over time, but I think one of the things that we didn't really touch on a little bit with the consent decrees is the role that the federal government has. And one of the things that we have definitely seen is a shift in this administration with some of the federal oversight that goes on in policing and some of the tone that comes from that. And it'll be interesting to see, in November, how that might impact things going forward. And interestingly, the one piece of legislation that gets touted is the First Step Act, which I do think it was a useful piece of legislation. But it's interesting to take that piece of legislative success and compare it with the current attitudes in the United States and the dissatisfaction that we have, not just in Philadelphia, but elsewhere on these issues. So lots more to do, but I want to thank all four of you, not just for being here this evening, but for the work that you've actually done to be, as Teddy Roosevelt would say, in the arena and to really engage with these issues and try to solve them in real time, because the theoretical is, I think, is important, but the actual is what makes change. And you guys have all done that. I really appreciate you. I want to thank you for your service. I want to thank you for your time this evening. On behalf of my colleagues at the law school, at the Toll Public Interest Center, the Office of Inclusivity Engagement, and I want to thank our IT and events teams that are allowing us to have conversations like this, even when we can't come together physically. So we will post this recording as quickly as we can. But thanks to all of you, and we'll look forward to continuing these conversations. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.